Behind the imposing facade of the Third Reich, behind the banners of power, racial purity, and iron discipline, lay lives marked by insecurity, sexual repression, and intimate confusion. Rudolf Hess, the devoted follower of Hitler, maintained a romantic relationship without physical contact for years, guided by an almost spiritual devotion to Hitler that eclipsed any romantic bond. His extreme shyness kept him away from intimacy, focusing his affection on the Führer. Heinrich Himmler, for his part, was the personification of contradiction. Physically weak, insecure, and withdrawn, he promoted abstinence as a moral ideal during his youth. It wasn't until the age of 28 that he had his first intimate experience, a contrast to the authority with which he would later dictate rules on sexuality and reproduction. At the center of this web stood Hitler, emotionally distant and reserved. Medical reports suggest that he may have been menorchid, a condition that may have influenced his development. His private life was marked by restraint. He chose control over desire, focused exclusively on his final goal, his Germany. Gera Borman, the prophetess of polygamy in the Third Reich. The relationship between Gera Borman and her husband Martin Bormann, an influential head of the Nazi Party Chancellery and Hitler's right-hand man, was one of the most unusual and disturbing within the Nazi sphere. Gera promoted the idea of eliminating traditional monogamy and replacing it with a model she called a national emergency union, which would allow polygamy as a tool to accelerate the reproduction of Aryan offspring considered pure by the standards of the Third Reich. In her personal writings, Gera Borman expressed ideas that were surprising, even by the standards of the Third Reich. She believed that the model of polygamy practiced in certain Islamic cultures could be perfectly adapted to Nazi Germany. In her view, it was a useful strategy that should not be overlooked. She admired historical figures such as Muhammad, whom she described as a pragmatic leader capable of forming solid armies thanks to that multiple family structure. Gera openly criticized Christian churches for rejecting such practices, accusing them of maintaining a limited and outdated vision that, according to her, hindered the Reich's progress toward a stronger and more fertile society. During the Nazi regime, some high-ranking officials explored the idea of implementing polygamy to increase the Aryan population, although this proposal was never made official. Gera Borman fervently supported this idea, no matter how controversial it seemed. Her devotion to her husband remained unshakable even when he began an extramarital relationship with actress Manja Behrens. Martin Bormann corresponded with Gera, detailing his relationship with Behrens. In one of his letters, he expressed his happiness at being doubly married and asked Gera what she thought of her crazy husband. Far from showing discontent, Gera responded promptly, offering her unconditional support. This dynamic reflects Gera's consistency with her beliefs and her commitment to the regime's ideologies. She considered her husband's extramarital relationships a contribution to the strengthening of the German people. Her stance underscores the complexity of personal relationships within the Nazi hierarchy and how political doctrines influence the private lives of its members. Gera Borman, in addition to feeling a deep love for her husband, Martin Bormann, harbored unbreakable respect and admiration for Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist doctrine. Far from resigning herself to the role of a silent victim in the face of Martin's extramarital affairs, Gera embraced them with pride and conviction. Contrary to the general perception in Berlin, where it was assumed she endured these situations with resignation, the reality was diametrically opposed. Not only did she approve of her husband's affairs, but she actively promoted them, considering them a natural manifestation of a true National Socialist's duty. In a letter to Martin, Gera articulated her perspective. In the case of Manja, you just have to make sure she has a child one year and I another the next, so that you always have an active woman by your side. Gera Borman remained true to her convictions by having 10 children with Martin Bormann between 1930 and 1943, for which she was awarded the Nazi Party's Gold Medal. Adolf Hitler sponsored their firstborn, who was named Martin Adolf. In a letter, Gera suggested passing a law after the war that would allow healthy men to have 2 wives, to which her husband replied that the Führer shared that opinion. Although Adolf Hitler enjoyed notable popularity among German women, captivated by his oratory and charisma, he never formalized polygamy in Germany. It has been suggested that his reluctance may have been due to socio-political convictions or personal limitations. On the other hand, Martin Bormann and his wife Gerda actively promoted the idea of polygamy as a means of strengthening the Aryan race. However, this proposal never transcended the private realm of their marriage. Martin Bormann died in May 1945 during an attempted escape from Berlin, while Gerda died of cancer in Italy a year later. Shadows of desire, the disturbing sexuality of the Führer. Adolf Hitler's sexuality has been widely speculated upon. Although there is no conclusive evidence, many historians suggest that the dictator may have been, by nature, asexual. Throughout his life, he showed little or no interest in maintaining intimate relationships, and everything indicates that this tendency was consciously and voluntarily reinforced. Some medical reports mention a possible physiological anomaly. Hitler may have been monorchid, that is, he had only one testicle, which could have influenced his sexual development. However, beyond the physical aspects, his behavior suggested a marked aversion to intimate contact. He never showed attraction to men, and his relationships with women were few, distant, and at times traumatic. What seems most plausible is that Hitler suffered from a form of tactophobia, a phobia of physical contact, and that his detachment from sexuality placed him among that segment of the population that does not experience sexual desire. Although strange to many, this is not an isolated phenomenon. There are people who live entirely detached from sexual impulses and feel no attraction to anyone, not even curiosity about it. From his early adult years, Hitler tended to form emotional and social bonds almost exclusively with men. In his youth, he established very close ties with companions like August Kubizek, Reinhold Hannisch, and Rudolf Häusler. With them, he shared humble lodgings, often in precarious conditions, ranging from cheap boarding houses to homeless shelters in the poorest areas of Vienna and Munich. While these cohabitations reveal a clear inclination toward male environments and intense relationships with men, there is no evidence indicating that these relationships were sexual in nature. The absence of known intimate ties with women and his constant proximity to male figures have been interpreted in many ways, but none can be confirmed with certainty. In 2001, Professor Lothar Machtan from the University of Hamburg published a work in which he argued that Hitler was homosexual. However, his arguments, based on speculation and circumstantial evidence, did not withstand the scrutiny of the academic community. Most historians dismissed his theory for lack of rigor and documentary solidity, and since then, serious research has not followed that line. In Hitler's case, this tendency toward emotional and sexual detachment also appears to have been integrated as part of his ideological construction. Influenced by thinkers of pan-Germanism and radical anti-Semitism, he promoted an ascetic lifestyle that included vegetarianism, absolute rejection of alcohol, and strict control over the instincts. For these ideologues, meat symbolized uncontrolled virility, testosterone, and sexual desire. Avoiding it was, therefore, a way to preserve supposed spiritual and physical purity. Hitler adopted these principles fervently, turning the repression of his impulses into another component of his worldview, rigid, restrained, and obsessed with the domination of body and will. In his autobiography, Mein Kampf, 1925, Hitler barely mentions those early years of his life. Instead, he jumps directly from his childhood to his experiences during the First World War, where he describes the soldiers in his regiment as a glorious male community. This exaltation of male camaraderie, already highlighted in Mein Kampf by referring to the soldiers as a glorious male community, was not accidental. Hitler idealized exclusively male environments as spaces of strength, loyalty, and discipline, free from what he considered emotional or sensual distractions. In that model, there was no room for intimacy or desire. Everything had to be subordinated to duty and the cause. Male camaraderie replaced any form of traditional emotional bond and became the foundation of his vision of a hierarchically organized society, united by obedience and the will to fight, not by emotion or tenderness. Within this logic, sexuality was perceived as an obstacle. Not just the physical act, but also courtship, affections, and emotions associated with romantic desire were seen as elements that weakened character. Hitler not only avoided these expressions in his private life, but also rejected them ideologically. For him, channeling that energy into action, combat, or the construction of the Reich was a duty. Passion had to be transformed into political fervor. Restraint became a tool of power. He who controls his impulses also dominates his environment. This extreme asceticism was not an isolated trait, but a central part of his construction as a leader. Hitler sought to project the image of a man completely devoted to a historical mission, immune to earthly pleasures or temptations. In his mind, that elevated him above the rest. While others succumbed to the excesses of the body, he remained in a kind of functional purity, willing to sacrifice everything, including personal intimacy, for his worldview. This denial of desire not only reinforced his authority but also legitimized, in his logic, the demand for sacrifice he would impose on millions. At the age of 37, already established as a rising political figure, Hitler attempted to establish relationships with women, partly to protect his public image and avoid being vulnerable to blackmail related to his private life. However, these attempts proved unsatisfactory or failed to materialize. In his residences in Munich, Berlin, and Obersalzberg, he always kept a portrait of his mother hanging above the headboard of his bed as a constant presence. Almost none of the female relationships he tried to cultivate went beyond the superficial or symbolic. 8 of the women with whom Hitler had some kind of intimate bond tried to take their own lives, and 6 succeeded. He showed interest both in film actresses and in adolescents who had barely begun puberty. His first girlfriend during his adolescence in Linz was more of a fantasy. They never spoke. He simply watched her from afar for years. The young woman, Stephanie Isaac, was of Jewish descent and curiously ended up being, along with the idealized figure of his mother, the model of what he considered the ideal Aryan woman. At the age of 38, Hitler began a relationship with Maria Reiter, a 16-year-old girl educated in a convent who attempted suicide in 1927 when he suddenly lost interest in her. Reiter told Stern magazine in 1959 that 4 years after her failed suicide attempt, she shared a night of passion with the man she could never forget, but discovered that his sexual tastes were too extreme for her, and they never saw each other again. Hitler always sought to keep his personal life in the shadows. Aware of the impact certain details could have on his public image, he strove to build a carefully controlled facade. Once in power, the Nazi apparatus, including the Gestapo and the SS, took charge of erasing any compromising trace. Documents were destroyed, witnesses silenced, and every indication of his intimacy was eliminated to preserve the Führer's spotless image. In contrast, his relationship with women was distant and complicated. The most controversial of all was with his niece Geli Raubal, who lived with him in Munich. Geli was 17 when she met Hitler in 1925. Despite not fitting the stereotype of the Aryan woman exalted by the regime, she had dark hair, an independent character, and a strong Viennese accent. She quickly became the center of his attention. She was attractive, spontaneous, and loved music, qualities that powerfully caught the future dictator's eye. From that moment on, Hitler began spending more and more time with her. He accompanied her to dinners, theater performances, and shows, proudly presenting her to his inner circle. Those who witnessed the cohabitation between Hitler and Geli Raubal soon noticed the intensity of the bond that united them. To many, it was evident that the Nazi leader felt something more than just familial affection for his niece. His attitude toward her was open, constant, and laden with unusual attention. He showed pride in having her nearby and enjoyed exhibiting her in public, as if she were an essential part of his private world. Over time, this closeness turned into an emotional obsession. Hitler seemed torn between the desire to have her only for himself and the need to completely control her. Geli was not just his companion. She became a decorative figure in his daily life and, at the same time, a prisoner of his demands. After the war, one of Geli's former secret lovers, Emil Morris, offered a description that helps explain why Hitler was so captivated by his half-niece. According to him, Geli had a natural, striking attractiveness that did not go unnoticed. He claimed that when she walked down the street, people would turn their heads to look at her, something rare in a city as reserved as Munich. Her long black hair, of which she was especially proud, and her way of dressing, which revealed her legs with ease, contributed to that magnetism. Geli returned her uncle's affection with enthusiasm. She deeply admired the man who was beginning to captivate the masses and who, for her, had an almost unattainable aura. Despite his rigid public persona, Hitler knew how to be charming and mysterious in private, which increased the young woman's fascination. According to those closest to her, Geli did not hide her desire to one day become Mrs. Hitler. Her admiration was evident, and she followed him constantly, enthralled by his presence and status. However, those who knew her also described her as flirtatious and unserious in her relationships with other men. Geli's devotion to her uncle was even reflected in her letters. In one of them, sent to a friend, she spoke proudly of her Uncle Alf and his ability to turn any moment into a grand, almost theatrical scene, as if out of a Wagner opera. She was impressed by the attention they received every time they went out together, like at Café Heck, where they were surrounded by admirers and women who approached to kiss his hand. This environment of constant adulation only fed the spell that Hitler cast over her. His closest circle also noticed the attraction. Her singing instructor in Munich recalled that Geli spoke openly of her love for Hitler and her desire to marry him. Even so, other sources offer a different view, that of an impressionable young woman who fell under the influence of a powerful figure who subjected her to excessive control. Ernst Hanfstaengl, a journalist close to Hitler's circle and a key figure in his political rise, pointed out that both Geli and her mother were completely dependent on the Nazi leader, which partly explained the constant closeness between them. This financial and emotional dependence strengthened Hitler's control over his niece, keeping her always under his influence. The forced cohabitation and isolation from the rest of the world reinforced a dynamic in which he made all the decisions, and she remained. As for the sexual dimension of their relationship, although some high-ranking Nazis suspected there was physical intimacy between the two, there were no concrete confirmations. It was speculated that Hitler had found in Geli the only woman capable of arousing his desire and alleviating his impotence, or that, conversely, the young woman had been manipulated to satisfy private and unconventional practices. However, none of these versions could be definitively proven, and the veil of mystery surrounding their bond remained intact even after Geli's death. Geli, who initially showed interest in studying medicine, eventually turned to singing. This change of direction did not bother Hitler, who imagined her as a heroine out of a Wagner opera, destined to shine on stage and win over the public. However, the reality was very different. According to one of the vocal instructors linked to the Nazi Party, her voice lacked expression and her theatrical skills were virtually non-existent. Despite this, Hitler continued to show a weakness for her, behaving in a childish and affectionate way when they were not under the gaze of others. Over time, their relationship began to grow increasingly oppressive. Hitler desired absolute control over Geli, limiting her contact with any other man. His behavior became possessive and controlling, treating her as if she were his partner in private. Although he allowed her certain luxuries and indulgences, he did not tolerate her having a life of her own. When he discovered that Geli had had a relationship with another young man, and later with his own chauffeur, he decided to send her away for a while, distancing her from everything he considered a threat. His objective was clear: to keep her only for himself, under his exclusive domain. Hitler exercised extreme control over every aspect of Geli's life. He did not allow her to go out alone unless accompanied by her mother or someone he fully trusted. He forbade her from attending dances, parties, or any social event where she could freely interact. Even when Geli wanted to swim in the Chiemsee or the Königssee, he would accompany her himself, despite his notable discomfort about appearing in a swimsuit in public. On several occasions, he ordered party members to watch her and report on the letters she received, reinforcing constant surveillance. Despite this evident obsession, historians agree that there is no conclusive evidence that Hitler maintained a sexual relationship with his half-niece. The debate remains open even among experts, and there is no consensus on the matter. Some researchers argue that the relationship crossed intimate boundaries from the time Hitler moved to Munich and assigned Geli a private room in his residence. However, these theories, no matter how solid or scandalous they may seem, have not been confirmed with direct evidence, leaving that aspect of their bond in the shadows of speculation. Whether true or not, the speculations about the nature of their relationship are overshadowed by the undeniable fact that the bond between Hitler and Geli ended abruptly and tragically in September 1931. By that time, they had been living together for 2 years in a luxurious apartment in Munich, with 5 servants at their disposal. Despite the comfort, the residence had become a golden cage for Geli, who had everything except the freedom to interact with whomever she wanted. Between September 17th and 18th, according to sources from the time, a heated argument occurred between the two. Hitler, overprotective and controlling, left shortly afterward on a political trip, leaving the young woman alone in the home. Barely 15 minutes after his departure, Geli took one of Hitler's own pistols and shot herself. The police investigation concluded it was a voluntary death, even after questioning Hitler himself. However, the exact reason for her death remains unclear. One version holds that Geli wanted to travel to Vienna with a new suitor, something Hitler had categorically forbidden. Other theories point to the emotional exhaustion of the young woman, suffocated by her uncle's constant control. Whatever the truth, the death of Geli Raubal remains one of the darkest and most enigmatic episodes in Adolf Hitler's personal life. Geli Raubal's death in 1931 marked a turning point in Adolf Hitler's personal life. The complex relationship he maintained with women, previously concealed behind his bond with his niece, once again became a visible conflict. At that time, there seemed to be no clear alternative that could replace the emotional role Geli had occupied. This loss came at a critical moment, just as Hitler was experiencing a political rise after the 1930 Reichstag elections. As a public figure, he could not disappear without explanation, and his apparent rejection of marriage began to generate speculation among both his supporters and his adversaries. In addition to the public challenge, Hitler faced an internal personal crisis. His carefully constructed image was also a source of psychological motivation, and he feared that the blow would weaken him not only in the eyes of others but in his own self-perception. In the months following Geli Raubal's death, Hitler began to surround himself again with women who, in addition to being attractive and determined, showed a clear interest in approaching him emotionally and politically. Although he had the option to marry, he chose to maintain his image as an unattainable leader, avoiding any sentimental commitment that might weaken the myth he had built around his figure. It was in this context that Magda Quandt, then Joseph Goebbels' secretary, met Hitler and became deeply captivated by him. She admired his leadership and the National Socialist vision he represented. Although she expressed her desire to fully unite with him, she ultimately married Goebbels himself, which allowed her to remain in the intimate nucleus of power. Her devotion to Hitler, however, extended beyond her bond with her husband. In early 1932, at age 43 and with growing popularity, Hitler continued to arouse admiration among many women in his circle. However, he avoided publicly engaging in romantic relationships. Among the female figures who captured his attention was filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl. Her artistic talent and charismatic presence did not go unnoticed, and Hitler showed particular interest in her, although the bond that united them was more strategic than intimate. The connection with Leni was more strategic than personal. Hitler valued her aesthetic ability to project the image of the regime, and her presence at official events strengthened the visual narrative of power. However, despite these associations, no woman came to occupy a formal romantic role alongside the Führer. The ideal female figure for him was the symbolic representation of sacrifice, beauty, and loyalty to the Reich, rather than a personal companion. The dark fragility of the Reich, Himmler's sexual secret. In stark contrast to the physical ideal that the Nazi regime tirelessly promoted, Heinrich Himmler embodied a living paradox. In his mid-20s, Himmler had a frail physique, vision problems that forced him to constantly rely on glasses, and an unimpressive face marked by a receding jawline. His weak health was another obstacle. Unable to participate in vigorous sports or tolerate large meals, he felt constant frustration regarding his body and appearance. His romantic life in youth was virtually non-existent, to the point that he defended sexual abstinence as a moral ideal. Ironically, years later, he would bitterly confess that he would have preferred to have had more intimate experiences during those years. It wasn't until the age of 28 that he finally had his first sexual experience, a late development that sharply contrasted with the confidence and physical attractiveness of Margaret. the woman who would later enter his life and whose character greatly stood out compared to the insecurity that defined Himmler's personality. At the beginning of the 1930s, Himmler faced a personal crisis regarding his perception of homosexuality, primarily due to his previous friendship and mentorship with Ernst Röhm, leader of the SA. Since the mid-1920s, Röhm had guided Himmler, supporting him in political and military matters, becoming a decisive influence in his professional development. However, Röhm's well-known homosexuality would eventually become a serious threat to that friendship. As the top leader of the SS during the party's difficult electoral campaigns, Himmler was well aware that political opponents were using Röhm's sexual orientation as a weapon to discredit the Nazi Party. This became clear when the socialist newspaper Münchner Post publicly revealed Röhm's homosexuality in April and June of 1931. Additionally, in March 1932, the magazine Echo published the controversial Heimsoth letters, further confirming these accusations. Amid this complex situation, Himmler decided to radically redefine the SS, clearly distinguishing it from the homosexual model of masculinity represented by Röhm. This process led him to deeply question his concept of homosexuality, establishing a clear dividing line between his own masculine image and the one Röhm publicly projected. As a result, from at least March 1932 onward, Himmler found himself unable to publicly support any policy that could call into question his own concept of masculinity or closely associate him with the model embodied by Röhm. During the early 1930s, the relationship between Himmler and Röhm was complex and filled with tension. For Himmler, Röhm became a latent threat, but due to Röhm's powerful position at the head of the SA and Hitler's need for them, he couldn't abruptly distance himself. Between March 1932 and the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, Himmler maintained a delicate balance. He attempted to separate himself politically from Röhm without completely breaking their personal and professional relationship. This uncomfortable position led him to act contradictorily toward the homosexual community. One example of this occurred in 1933 when he ordered the closure of homosexual clubs, a decision he later publicly discussed in one of his speeches. Equally revealing was the destruction by Nazi militants of Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Research in Berlin on May 6, 1933. Although Himmler did not directly acknowledge his participation in these events during that speech, he did later refer to the valuable informational material obtained by the Gestapo thanks to Hirschfeld's collected research. In contrast to his thoughts and actions in early 1933, Himmler maintained a connection with Röhm just 6 weeks after the destruction of Hirschfeld's institute. On June 17, 1933, Reinhard Heydrich, Himmler's second-in-command and SS Gruppenführer, chose Ernst Röhm to be the godfather of his firstborn son. Considering that Röhm was then chief of staff of the SA, Heydrich's choice seemed logical while the SA remained valuable to the Nazi movement. However, when the party turned its back on Röhm during the Night of the Long Knives a year later, Himmler quickly severed all ties with the man who had once been his mentor and began direct attacks against the homosexual community. In his 1937 speech in Bad Tölz, Himmler laid out his final vision regarding homosexuality and masculinity, influenced by a personal crisis that traced back to his youth. Initially, Himmler believed that homosexuality was exclusively related to effeminate men, following theories promoted by Magnus Hirschfeld. However, after the purge of Ernst Röhm and other homosexual men in 1934, he realized that there was another homosexual model more associated with extreme masculinity. This discovery provoked an internal conflict. He had to distance himself from both the effeminate stereotype and the hypermasculine one to maintain his own masculine and heteronormative identity. To resolve this internal crisis, Himmler drew upon his own youthful experience. He revealed that in his adolescence he had struggled against what he perceived as perverse temptations associated with masturbation and homosexuality, which he linked to shyness and difficulties interacting with women. The personal solution he found, based on discipline, loyalty, and appropriate contact with women, especially through dancing and social gatherings, became his model for German youth. Thus, Himmler advocated for the need to promote early heterosexual relationships, asserting that any deviation from this traditional behavior could lead young people toward homosexuality. Finally, Himmler linked his rejection of homosexuality with a critique of the Catholic Church and certain male sectors of German society. According to him, the Church, especially in monasteries and religious hierarchies, was dominated by covert homosexual practices, which he saw as a threat similar to the one he had identified in certain Nazi circles. In this way, the speech revealed his concern over excessive masculinity in male organizations, the lack of proper appreciation toward women, and the need to protect a strict heteronormative division of gender roles to ensure the future health of the German nation. The hidden sexuality of Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess, one of Hitler's most faithful followers, met his future wife Ilse when he was 26 years old and she was still a teenager. The young woman was deeply captivated by him from the very beginning, but Hess remained distant and reluctant toward any kind of romantic approach. In fact, according to historical records, Hess was a virgin and experienced an internal conflict regarding his own body and sexual impulses. For several years during their courtship, he maintained a relationship completely devoid of physical intimacy. Despite this, they shared an unusual emotional bond, almost mystical, that seemed to be fueled by something stronger than desire, a mutual adoration for Adolf Hitler. Both attended a lecture by the future dictator together in the early 1920s, and from that moment became completely fascinated. That shared admiration for the Führer was what cemented their connection as a couple, despite the total lack of a sexual life. From that first encounter, Rudolf Hess developed a bond of absolute devotion toward Adolf Hitler, one that bordered on the mystical. For him, Hitler was not just a political leader, but an almost sacred figure, a kind of superior being whose words carried the weight of revelation. It was Hess who, long before others, began referring to him as Mein Führer, not merely as a title, but as a statement of deep, almost religious loyalty. His behavior in Hitler's presence was revealing. Despite being a reserved man with little skill in public speaking, Hess would transform when delivering speeches that included references to Hitler. His tone changed, his voice became exalted, and his emotion was so evident that it sometimes seemed to verge on a trance. The praise would overflow, and there were moments when his body language conveyed a mixture of veneration and enthusiasm that few fully understood. Hitler, for his part, would receive these gestures with a mix of discomfort and restrained satisfaction. Though he was reserved about showing emotions, he did seem to appreciate such absolute loyalty. On more than one occasion, witnesses noted that the Führer, typically impassive in most situations, appeared to blush briefly in response to Hess's passionate declarations. The dynamic between the two was unique, a relationship marked by emotional imbalance, in which Hess gave himself completely while Hitler, without fully reciprocating, accepted the role of idol with a subtle gesture of approval. Among Rudolf Hess's personal documents, now preserved in the National Archives of the United Kingdom in Kew, historian Pierre Servant discovered an especially revealing note. In it, Hess clearly expressed a feeling he himself defined as love toward Hitler, accompanied by a vehement desire to be by his side again. Such statements have led more than one researcher to question the true nature of their bond, especially during the years they spent together in Landsberg prison after the failed coup of 1923. The emotional intensity Hess projected toward the Nazi leader was uncommon, even within the innermost circle of the regime, and it is all the more striking when one considers that Hitler was a man rarely given to displays of affection. With the exception of his famous dog Blondie, he was hardly ever seen showing tenderness toward another living being. However, he seemed to make an exception for Hess. There are testimonies that, on specific occasions, the two were seen leaving the office arm in arm, an unusual image within the rigid choreography of power in the Third Reich. Although there is no conclusive evidence that there was a romantic or sexual relationship between them, it is clear that their connection went beyond the merely political. Hess's devotion far exceeded ideological loyalty, and while Hitler never openly reciprocated with similar gestures, his small signs of closeness toward Hess continue to fuel debate over the boundaries and nuances of their enigmatic relationship. The unusual closeness between Hitler and Rudolf Hess soon fueled speculation both within and outside the Nazi Party. Hess's absolute devotion to the leader, bordering on idolatry, earned him mocking nicknames among his comrades, one of the most well-known being Miss Hess. His behavior, marked by overflowing admiration and almost reverential gestures, began to make several factions within the party uncomfortable, especially those with a more pragmatic and revolutionary outlook. In particular, the more leftist wing of the movement viewed this servile attitude with suspicion, accusing it of reproducing structures akin to leader worship or even remnants of monarchism. The blind obedience and almost emotional enthusiasm with which Hess spoke of Hitler did not align with the image of virile militaristic camaraderie that the party sought to project during those years of ideological consolidation. As historian Pierre Servant notes, some early party members even suggested that the reserved Hess was not only excessively submissive, but that his fascination with Hitler might have had an unacknowledged intimate dimension. However, the gossip and criticism did not alter his behavior in the slightest. Throughout the 1920s, Hess maintained an attitude of absolute loyalty, and his veneration for Hitler only intensified. Quite literally, and without any shame, he symbolically prostrated himself before him, as if every step the leader took was sacred. Despite having been in a relationship with Ilse Pröll for years, Rudolf Hess showed no interest in formalizing the commitment. His life revolved almost entirely around Adolf Hitler, whom he admired with a devotion that bordered on the absolute. That admiration was so intense that, according to those who knew them, he often completely neglected his partner, ignoring her attempts at intimacy or any conversation about their future together. For Hess, anything unrelated to the Führer seemed to lack importance. It wasn't until 1927, during a private dinner the three of them shared, that an unexpected turning point occurred. In a surprising gesture, it was Hitler himself who, without consulting anyone, took Ilse's hand and placed it over Hess's, announcing aloud that they should marry. No one at the table dared to contradict him. In the party's universe, his word was law. The decision was sealed in that instant, and by the end of that same year, the wedding took place, more as an order followed than as the result of shared will. Settled in a modest apartment in Munich, the relationship remained equally distant in the intimate realm. Ilse would later confide to a friend that she felt like a nun trapped in a passionless life. Hess's refusal of sex fueled multiple theories, and to this day his behavior remains an enigma without a definitive answer. His fanatical conduct and almost romantic devotion to Hitler caused discomfort among other Nazi leaders, who considered him a misfit, or even a repressed homosexual overwhelmed by his feelings toward the Führer. The fact that it took them 10 years to have a child only further fueled such speculation. Although no romantic or sexual relationship between Hitler and Hess has ever been proven, the level of emotional attachment between them was profoundly unusual. Many historians continue to explore that angle, not merely out of curiosity, but because it may offer insights into the personal dynamics that influenced the course of the Nazi regime. The end of this story is marked by tragedy and disillusionment. In 1941, Hess undertook a mysterious solo flight to Scotland to try to negotiate peace with the United Kingdom without Hitler's approval. This action was considered an unforgivable betrayal, and although the dictator rarely showed emotion, several witnesses claim that this betrayal devastated him. Some even say that the sorrow he felt was comparable to the loss of his niece, Geli Raubal. According to those accounts, Hitler wept, and deep down he may have believed that Hess was in some way the only human being who truly loved him. Forbidden virility, the sexual contradiction of the Third Reich. In the early years of the Nazi rise to power, the SA, the party's stormtroopers, played a key role in consolidating control. Its leadership, headed by figures such as Ernst Röhm, presented a particularity that contrasted with the regime's official discourse. Several of its top members were openly homosexual. This reality, often ignored or minimized, reveals the internal contradictions of the movement, which on the one hand promoted a strict sexual morality, while temporarily tolerating certain behaviors at the highest levels of its paramilitary apparatus. Homosexuality within the SA was not seen by its protagonists as a transgression of the masculine ideal, but in some cases as a reaffirmation of a hardened, almost aggressive virility. It was a deeply militaristic vision of the body and discipline, where the bond between men, reinforced by communal living, physical training, and unbreakable loyalty, was considered more solid and pure than any tie to the female world. In this context, women were perceived as outsiders, unnecessary, or even as distractions that weakened the structure of the warrior. This coexistence between a covert homoerotic identity and an ultra-conservative system had its limits. Over time, Hitler realized that the growing power of the SA and its autonomous character represented a threat to his absolute control. The so-called Night of the Long Knives in 1934 put an end to this ambiguity. Röhm and other leaders were physically eliminated, and with them that tacit tolerance also vanished. From then on, Nazism hardened its discourse on sexual morality even further, transforming repression into state policy. Ernst Röhm, head of the SA and one of Hitler's earliest collaborators, was a fundamental figure in the rise of the National Socialist movement. Despite his influence, his personal trajectory has been largely overshadowed by the course of later events. In his early years within the party, there were no public signs revealing relevant aspects of his sex life. It wasn't until his stay in South America after the failed Munich Putsch of 1923 that information began to circulate linking him to homosexual relationships, particularly during his time in Bolivia. Upon returning to Germany in 1930, Röhm resumed his role as leader of the party's militias, but now with a different reputation. His sexual orientation, far from remaining private, became a topic of public knowledge among the movement's elite, and even more so among its detractors. Various SA leaders, men in powerful positions, shared similar profiles, which fed suspicion and external scrutiny. Both the Social Democratic Party and the Communists took advantage of this contradiction to launch media attacks. The newspaper Münchener Post, aligned with the SPD, published a series of reports under the title The Brotherhood of the Brown House, in which several members of the Nazi leadership were accused of engaging in illegal sexual behavior, including hiring male prostitutes. These accusations, beyond their political sensationalism, pointed to an evident tension within the Nazi movement. On one hand, it promoted a public image of discipline and strict morality, while on the other, it tolerated, at least for a time, practices that directly clashed with that narrative. The public exposure of homosexuality among the SA's top brass was no small matter. After being spread by the socialist and communist press of the time, especially in publications like the Münchener Post, the scandal reached the courts. Far from generating a defense of those implicated, these allegations were used as a strategy to politically discredit Nazism, at a time when homosexuality was still considered a crime or a sign of moral decay. Paradoxically, many sectors of the left shared a deeply conservative view of sexuality at the time. Instead of questioning the sexual repression imposed by the Nazi regime, they replicated similar prejudices. For much of early 20th century socialist thought, homosexuality was seen as an expression of bourgeois individualism or as a symptom of corruption typical of authoritarian regimes, an idea that even found echoes in the Soviet sphere. The writer Maxim Gorky once uttered a brutal phrase, "Exterminate the homosexuals and fascism will disappear." This perception, now obsolete, was rooted in the belief that fascism promoted a cult of strength and masculinity that, when taken to the extreme, rejected any notion of difference or complementarity. From that logic, some ideologues drew a parallel between homosexual desire and the desire for ideological homogeneity. Although this view lost ground over time, for decades it served to reinforce stigmas and justify silences, even from political positions considered progressive. Until the mid-20th century, much of the European left maintained a deeply critical view of homosexuality, often considering it a trait linked to authoritarianism, decadence, or bourgeois corruption. This idea, erroneous from a contemporary perspective, found support at the time in examples like that of the SA, whose structure and operation seemed to confirm those suspicions. The stormtroopers of the National Socialist Party were exclusively male formations, with an internal culture marked by a cult of strength, obedience, and virile camaraderie. In that closed context, characterized by the systematic rejection of the feminine figure and any form of vulnerability, some sectors of the left interpreted the bond between members not only as political or military, but also as a form of moral deviation. This approach, which sought to expose a supposed contradiction within Nazism, its moral rhetoric versus the private practices of its leaders, served for years as a tool for denunciation. The SA, beyond its political objectives, was turned into a symbol of what was considered a perversion of the masculine ideal. This narrative, reinforced by opposition publications and ideological discourses of the time, remained in force until, beginning in the second half of the 20th century, progressive thought began to critically reassess its own positions on sexuality. Madness for the Führer, Hitler's fascinating appeal. On April 3, 1923, the Münchner Post, the newspaper of the German Social Democratic Party, published a scathing note on the growing phenomenon surrounding Adolf Hitler. Devoted women, mesmerized by his figure, attending his speeches with tears in their eyes, pawning their jewelry and offering unconditional financial support. The National Socialist leader's response was not long in coming. Months later, on November 8th of that same year, following the failed coup attempt in Munich, NSDAP supporters stormed and destroyed the newspaper's offices as an act of retaliation. From the earliest stages of the movement, numerous women became key collaborators of Hitler. They not only provided financial backing, but also offered vital connections within the social and political elites of Bavaria. In 1926, when the party was on the verge of economic collapse, and Hitler threatened to take his own life due to impending bankruptcy, it was a woman who averted disaster. Elsa Bruckmann, an aristocrat of Romanian origin, personally brought him to the industrialist Emil Kirchdorf, who paid off the party's debts and ensured its survival. In her Munich home, Elsa hosted salons where Hitler was the guest of honor, surrounding him with influential figures. Her devotion was such that she gave him personal gifts and everyday objects with an almost ritualistic dedication. Hitler's emotional and strategic manipulation of his admirers was precise and calculated. He readily accepted jewelry, watches, money, or property offered by women captivated by his persona. Surviving documents from the time record pawned emerald pendants, diamond rings, and other valuable items used as collateral for personal loans. Female admiration also served as a gateway. Only those who demonstrated absolute devotion to the Führer gained access to the select inner circles of the Nazi entourage. The paradox lay in the fact that this very party promoted an ideology openly hostile to women in the public sphere. However, Hitler's charismatic allure neutralized all resistance. Female loyalty was not based on ideological alignment, but on a personal fascination that blurred the lines between political devotion and near-religious worship. Within the Third Reich, women could join the National Socialist Party and contribute financially like any male member, but their role within the power structure was clearly defined. Alfred Rosenberg, one of the regime's main ideologues, put the expected hierarchy in writing. Leadership of the state must remain exclusively in male hands. National Socialism upheld what it called the liberation of women from emancipation, a doctrine that aimed to return women to a purely domestic function, in open opposition to the social progress achieved during the Weimar Republic. Official messages repeated simple and forceful ideas. Men and women belonged to different natures, with roles separated by historical and biological mandate. These ideas, already unpopular among many sectors of German society in the 1930s, even sparked debates within the party itself. Joseph Goebbels, in his diaries, expressed opposition to the growing participation of women in public discourse. For him, motherhood and the education of children were the only truly noble duties of German women. He harshly criticized what he saw as false emancipation and prided himself on resisting, in his words, the terrorism of public opinion. Although the right to vote for women was not formally revoked after the Nazis came to power in 1933, it was rendered meaningless within the new totalitarian system. In practice, women were gradually removed from professional and academic life. One of the first measures was the law passed on April 25, 1933, which limited their presence in universities and educational institutions. This law set specific quotas. Only 10% of students could be female, and just 1.5% could be of Jewish origin. The Nazi view of women did not emerge as a unified doctrine, but as a synthesis of racist, nationalist, and romantic influences. Writings like Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler or The Myth of the 20th Century by Rosenberg, defined a model in which women were to act as bearers of the German people's biological heritage. Authors such as Walter Darre, with works like Peasantry as the life source of the Nordic race, reinforced that idealized image of the rural, fertile and submissive woman tasked with preserving the blood and spirit of the folk. Through publications like The ABCs of National Socialism, an idealized portrait was built that combined nationalist poetry with racial propaganda. The German woman was presented as a symbol of purity, silent strength, and the backbone of the home. This image, however, became an almost unattainable demand. In a personal ad published in a Munich newspaper, a party member summarized the requirements. He was seeking an Aryan woman, young, virgin, without property, capable of hard work, without adornment, without a past, and ready to ensure male offspring. A clear reflection of the restrictive and utilitarian mold in which the Nazi project sought to reduce women. In the years leading up to the Nazi rise, Germany had already made significant progress in female emancipation. The active participation. This image, however, became an almost unattainable demand. In a personal ad published in a Munich newspaper, a party member summarized the requirements. He was seeking an Aryan woman, young, virgin, without property, capable of hard work, without adornment, without a past, and ready to ensure male offspring. A clear reflection of the restrictive and utilitarian mold in which the Nazi project sought to reduce women. In the years leading up to the Nazi rise, Germany had already made significant progress in female emancipation. The active participation of women in public, labor, and cultural life was a consolidated reality, not a passing trend, as the ideologues of the Third Reich wanted people to believe. The image of the modern woman had taken hold not only in the media and cities, but also in the collective mindset. Female aviators, engineers, athletes, and scientists challenged traditional molds with determination and visibility. One notable example was Melita Schiller, later known as Countess von Stauffenberg, a doctor of physics and test pilot. During the 1930s, she carried out over 1,000 dive flights to test aerial navigation systems. Her skill earned her official recognition, but her profile was far removed from the model of womanhood that National Socialism sought to impose. A domestic, submissive figure confined to the home and reduced to mother and wife in service to the state. Despite the regime's propaganda, which exalted the woman of the spindle and kitchen, many women close to Nazi leaders did not fit that ideal. At official receptions, they were welcomed as decorative companions, but their behavior and lifestyle openly contradicted the principles promoted by party ideology. Eva Braun practiced sports, was interested in cinema, and followed the latest fashion trends. Emmy Goering, with a background in theater, enjoyed luxury and social recognition. Margareta Himmler, for her part, deeply despised her husband Heinrich Himmler's ideas and maintained a distant attitude toward official doctrine. Even the female figures who held positions within the party structure rarely lived according to the traditional values expected of them. Some, like Henriette von Schirach, promoted cultural activities, traveled frequently, and had little connection to the image of the obedient German mother. The number of children, another essential indicator in the regime's birth policy, was not exemplary among party elites. Only the Goebbels and Bormann families met the Nazi demographic expectations. Gera Borman was one of the few exceptions. A fervent believer in party tenets, she had 9 children with Martin Bormann and lived completely subordinated to both her husband and the Führer. She participated in doctrinal activities and fervently defended the idea of female sacrifice for the cause. She even devised a domestic model that allowed her husband's mistresses to live under the same roof, as long as they all shared the task of raising the children. For her, family and state were few. This thinking was taken to the extreme by Heinrich Himmler with the creation of the Lebensborn program. Its stated goal was to encourage births among women considered racially pure and men of similarly selected Germanic descent. Himmler explained that single women who wanted children could turn to this system without fear. The children would be protected and sponsored by the SS. These unions were not based on affection or legal ties, but on biological criteria in service of the Nazi racial project. From the Third Reich's propaganda apparatus, it was firmly asserted that German women did not seek independence or political participation, but rather domestic life, marriage, and motherhood. The factory, the office, or the parliament were portrayed as unsuitable places for them. However, this model was not only restrictive but strategically ineffective. By dismissing the intellectual and economic potential of women, the regime deprived itself of a vital force that, in contrast, the Allies effectively leveraged during the war. While Nazism limited female labor and promoted a rigid image of women as homemakers, other nations were incorporating millions of women into key sectors such as the arms industry. Even when labor shortages became critical, Hitler hesitated to mobilize women because of his own ideology, trapped by the ideal he himself had imposed. Rejection of modernity went so far as to socially sanction the use of makeup, high heels, or cigarettes by women, as if controlling their appearance were part of the racial purification project. Even though in practice many women in Nazi circles did not adhere to this model, and even though Lebensborn was already a radical measure, the plans outlined for after the war went even further. Gera Borman, wife of the party secretary, was a fervent advocate of legally expanding polygamy, based on the potential shortage of men after the conflict. She even noted that Hitler himself had considered the idea. The priority was to ensure offspring, regardless of the number of wives or the voluntary nature of the union. Martin Bormann, who already maintained multiple relationships with his wife's approval, enthusiastically supported these ideas. In private, proposals were discussed such as requiring every woman under 35 to have at least 4 children with Aryan men. Once that number was reached, the men would be released to continue their military duties. Measures to institutionalize emergency marriages and dismantle the traditional concept of monogamy through the legalization of secondary wives were also considered. The defeat of the Third Reich prevented these plans from being implemented. But the surviving documents and testimonies reveal the extent of an ideology that sought to completely transform the social structure through demographic engineering, without regard for the methods or the human consequences.